Our topic today is the two Cold Wars, the old one fading and the new one emerging, and what it all means for the U.S., for Europe, and for the world. We are at a momentous moment in U.S. history and global history. Real basic tectonic shifts are underway in the geopolitics we all have to live with. By Cold War, I simply mean the state of hostilities between the United States and its allies on the one hand, and the Soviet Union and its allies on the other hand. That runs roughly from the late 1940s, when it begins, to 1989-90, when the Soviet Union implodes and the Cold War comes to an end. It trickled on in ways I will describe in a moment, but those are the basic period. Half a century, long time, 50-odd years. In that time, the Cold War was led and organized by the United States. That made sense because it was the most powerful nation in the world at that time. All of the other contenders for possibly being powerful in the world, Britain, France, Russia, Germany, Japan, and that's about it, had all been destroyed in and by World War II. So when the war is over, 1945, the United States is left standing. With the one exception of Pearl Harbor, no bombs fell on the United States. Bombs fell all over every one of those other countries. The percentage of our military as a part of our labor force much smaller than in those other countries, and on and on and on. So the United States was in a position to shape the larger world that was much more powerful and much greater than any other country had. And the United States decided, as the dominant power, to do all kinds of things, to set up global institutions like the International Monetary Fund or the World Bank, which were heavily under the control of the United States, as they still are. The United States was in a position to make its own currency, the dollar, the world currency, which it was, and in many ways still is. The United States was able to dictate militarily to the rest of the world, which it did by developing the largest arsenal of nuclear weapons and 700 more than military bases around the world, particularly focused on ringing the Soviet Union, which the United States declared was its enemy. Which, by the way, had to be done because in World War II, from 1940 to 1945, Soviet Union was the ally of the United States, not the enemy. American and Soviet troops worked together to fight and defeat the German and the Japanese troops in that war. So you had a switch, which the United States did. And the Cold War enemy, the Soviet Union, and the bloc of countries called Eastern Europe, from Poland in the north to Bulgaria in the south, Warsaw Pact, if you like, that was the other side of that Cold War. Now, why did the United States do that? It did it because it served two key interests of the United States at the end of World War II. Number one was to use the language of our government, contain the Soviet Union, keep it blocked in over there in Russia, over there in Eastern Europe, and after a few years after the Chinese Revolution, over there in China too. That was one goal, and to achieve containment, the United States hooked up with its allies, mostly in Europe, but also including Canada, who was then considered a friend, to form NATO, North Atlantic Treaty Organization, a defense pact whose basic line was, we're all united against the Soviet Union, and we will fight, if any of us is attacked, we will fight as a bloc against the Soviet Union, which, given the dominance of the United States, made the enemies of the Soviet Union overwhelming, certainly frightened the Soviets at that time and for most of the years since. But there was a companion not often understood, but should have been understood as core to the Cold War, and that was the repression of domestic anti-capitalist political forces located within the working classes, not just of the United States, but of every one of the European countries, of Canada too. During the 1930s depression and during the wartime alliance with the Soviet Union, socialist and communist parties of various kinds had become much, much stronger in the United States than they had ever been, in Western Europe than they had ever been. They were real challengers for power. After World War II, the number 2 political party in Italy was the Italian Communist Party. In the first government that General de Gaulle set up after World War II was over, he had to give several cabinet posts to the Communist Party of France. Why? Because in Italy, in France, and in many other European countries, the core of the resistance to the Nazis were socialists and communists everywhere. And that made them very strong at the end of the war, understandably. The United States, too, saw an immense growth in the power and prestige of socialist and communist parties here in the United States. Repressing them was an urgent activity. Here in the United States, it had a particular twist, because what had grown most dramatically in the 1930s was the labor union movement, the CIO, much larger than the earlier AFL, as they merged eventually to be what we now call the AFL-CIO. And the leading militants who helped organize all those unions in the 1930s, yeah, they were socialists and communists, because those parties and the labor movement worked closely together, very successful. By World War II's end, the American employer class had a real enemy at home, the union movement, which had showed its power and showed its reach. That union movement had been strong enough to get the Social Security system passed during the Depression. The unemployment compensation program passed during the Depression. The first minimum wage ever passed in America during the Depression. The first federal jobs program for millions of unemployed people. Yeah, during the Great Depression, when the government had no money, the labor movement and the socialists and communists all got together and won those programs. The employer class had to pay for them, and they were not happy. So after the war, they wanted to crush what was called the New Deal coalition, unions, labor, to push back, to undo the New Deal. They've been trying to do that ever since, with growing success, I might add. But they started right after World War II, was part of the Cold War, because here was the link. You attacked the socialists and the communists and the labor unions. You attacked them for either being agents of Moscow, or dupes of Moscow, or fellow travelers. You changed the militant unionist at home from being that, which is what they were, to being an agent of a foreign power, which you could hate because you were already dealing with that foreign power, not as the ally they had just been, but as the evil empire you wanted to rebrand them as. So the Cold War involved NATO against Russia and an attack on the left inside the United States by treating them as agents of Russia. So you could nicely wrap it all together. Russia is why we have radicals in the United States. A nice argument because it shows that they're not really part of us. They're agents of somebody else. You don't want to admit that it's your own system that produces the unionist, the activist, the social critic. So you can blame it on outsiders. All embattled regimes blame it on the outsider. Can't admit it's an inside job, always is. But okay, we had a Cold War, and it worked. It isolated the Soviet Union, and they were able to smash the left. They were able to do it better in the United States and Britain than they were on the continent because of the anti-fascist resistance movements in Europe against the Nazis had given socialists and communists the kind of reputation that made it impossible for those governments to repress them. They tried. They succeeded in many ways, but they could never do what they could do in the United States and Britain. And the history of those countries ever since has showed that. Now, the calculation behind all of this was that the United States capitalists, the employer class, would be insecure if threatened effectively by the Soviet Union as a foreign power and by unionists, socialists, and communists at home. And so here was a twin-pronged attack, but it had one more purpose. Anti-communism at home and anti-Soviet NATO abroad was a wonderful cover to hide something else that was going on, namely the expansion of the American empire. World War II had exhausted the European countries. Those are the ones that had pioneered colonialism. They had the great empires. Britain had India and many other parts of the world. The French had huge portions of Africa. The Germans at one point had also had it. They had lost it a little earlier. The Japanese were expanding. All of those people's empires had been destroyed. They couldn't afford to maintain them after the terrible losses they suffered in World War II. So as they withdrew or were thrown out of their colonies by revolutions, anti-colonial revolutions, the United States stepped in. It didn't have the bad reputation. It had not participated in the old colonialism. It had been a colony itself who fought a violent revolution to stop being one. And that was the mood of the late 20th century. So the United States could quietly come in and establish commercial, industrial, and financial relationship, bringing the dollar, bringing loans from the IMF and World Bank that it controlled. It took over, and its 700 bases were a very convenient accompaniment to becoming the dominant economic power in the world. The U.S. empire replaced the European empires across the second half of the 20th century. But it wasn't admitted and it wasn't made public. It was hidden behind the Cold War that we have to fight with that evil Russian empire. Russia did develop nuclear weapons during the Cold War, so they became a serious military problem for the U.S., but they were never a political problem. The United States outmaneuvered them in the United Nations at every turn, and they were laughably behind the United States economically across the entire Cold War. The GDP, the gross domestic product of the United States during the Cold War, was always 10 to 20 times that of the Soviet Union. There was no economic competition. There couldn't have been. The Soviet Union had no chance. And so in that period, the United States accomplished what it set out to. It did contain the Soviet Union. It did. And it did squash the labor movement, the socialists, and the communists. Labor movement was 1/3 of our working class population in 1950. It's now 1/10. A very dramatic, systematic drop. The Communist Party barely holds on to a minimum existence in the United States, and the same is true for the two old socialist parties. They exist, but their influence is a tiny fraction of what it once was at the end of World War II. The old Cold War did its job. And then a number of things happened to change everything. And that's what's so important to understand now. Number one, the Soviet Union, which was the whole story of the Cold War, collapsed. In 1989 and 90, it's gone from the story. You can't sustain a Cold War against an enemy who isn't there. The Soviet Union went through a crisis period lasting several years, during which it gave up its socialist or communist characters and became another capitalist country. Yes, the government has a big role there, but it does in many parts of Europe. That's not unique to Russia. It does in many parts of the world, which are not called a Soviet bloc, never were, and aren't now. The Soviet Union became another, albeit big, European capitalist country with a large governmental sector. But it really shook up the whole idea of the Cold War, number one. Number two, the rest of the world recovered from all the damage done in World War II. Took them decades, but they did, led by, in the capitalist world, Germany and Japan, who really came roaring back to become the dominant capitalist countries other than the United States in the latter part of the 20th century. And then, even more dramatic, much more dramatic, the explosive growth of capitalist relationships in China. And by capitalist relationships, I mean the employer-employee way of organizing business, whether that's in a private enterprise or one owned and operated by the government. If you hold on to the minority of executives and leaders and capitalists, it doesn't matter whether they're state employees or private people, the relationship in production between them and the mass of employees is quite similar. That's why we call one of them private capitalism and the other one state capitalism. Socialism sort of gets involved with state capitalism, and you have to be a little bit more complicated. China holds on to employer-employee relationships, but it also has the right, as it does, to claim that it is socialism with Chinese characteristics. It's a little bit like Scandinavia was socialism with Swedish characteristics, or Germany is socialism with German characteristics, and so on. My point here is that the changes that happened, particularly at the end of the 20th century, were the beginning of the end of the old Cold War, and we're now living at the end. Here were other changes that played a role. The United States empire began to shrink. Its place was taken, particularly in the last few years, by the rising economic power, strength, and wealth of China. For the first time in a century, the United States has a major economic competitor. The Soviet Union never was. China is. And China with its allies, the BRICS, is extremely formidable. It's a richer bloc than the United States and its major allies, Germany, Britain, France, Italy, Canada, and Japan, the so-called G7. They are a smaller economic unit than China and its BRICS allies, and the whole world is now adjusting to the change, the end of the dominance of the United States. It itself, the United States, cannot afford the cost of its shrinking empire. It tried to hold on in Vietnam. It was defeated. It tried to hold on in Afghanistan. It was defeated. It tried to hold on in Iraq. It was defeated. The war in Ukraine is a process of defeating the United States. It isn't, therefore, all that surprising that you would eventually see a political movement in the United States, Trump, saying, let's cut our losses. We cannot do it. We cannot maintain an empire against what's happening in the rest of the world. We can't do it militarily, even though we remain the strongest military force. Our opponents, now Russia and China together, are really a serious opponent across the board. And we've solidified their alliance by trying in Ukraine to break it up. Didn't work. Had the opposite effect, strengthening that side of the divide. And Mr. Trump is withdrawing from Ukraine, withdrawing from NATO, hemming and hawing along the way, frightening the Europeans who entrusted their defense to the United States' overwhelming dominance, having misunderstood, as American leaders did, that empires that go up like that also come down, that the country that's dominant at one point isn't at another, and you'd be hitching your wagon to possibly the wrong horse. The Europeans are discovering, shocked, frightened, that that's them. The United States is pulling out. The cost-benefit analysis about all those military bases, all those war efforts, they can't do it. As it is, they've been paying for those wars and paying for their defense establishment by borrowing money. The debt of the United States relative to the GDP of the United States is now worse than all of Europe. They didn't have to borrow for their defense. We did that. And we got a lot of benefits here in the United States. The government pumping all this money, tax money, borrowed money to sustain the military, boosted the American economy. Came to be known in economic circles as military Keynesianism, which is exactly what it was. But it's over now. The empire is shrinking, and there is no sign anywhere that it's going to come back, other than in the wild statements of Mr. Trump, and we know what credence to give them. It's shrinking everywhere. And just as Mr. Trump had to recognize it when it came to the war in Ukraine, his successors, Republican, Democrat, or other, will have to come to terms with it more in the years ahead. But they don't want to. The United States is a remarkable place in which I was born and lived and worked all my life. Remarkable not in the ways it likes to imagine, but in this way. It practices what psychologists call denial. We've talked about that in these presentations in the past. In the last election, neither Mr. Trump nor Ms. Harris could speak a word about a declining empire. They couldn't speak a word about the losses in these wars and what that means. They couldn't speak a word about the rise of China and the BRICS in terms of what it says about, oh no, all you had was denial. We are the biggest, greatest country in the world, repeated over and over. That kind of repetition usually signals that whoever's doing it knows somewhere that it isn't true, but reassures themselves by saying it over and over. We do have a choice. We can sit down with the emerging Chinese economic powerhouse that has already shown us it can match every American technological breakthrough by a Chinese equivalent. Nobody else can do that. The Europeans can't do it. They're acutely aware that they are unable to do it. The economic powerhouses are the United States and China, and they will either sit down and work out how to share and live in this planet together, or they'll destroy everybody, themselves included. We all know which we hope for. You don't need me to say it. But we don't have that yet. Instead, we have the United States provoking China at every turn, and the Chinese defending themselves, understandably. It's a very old story, the empire that goes down, trying to prevent the others that are emerging. Never works very long. In the end, it's kind of easy to say which way it's going to go. It's already becoming clear now. But that doesn't mean that the declining will understand or face its reality. That may take more disappointments, more lost wars, more economic turmoil at home. Our problem is our capitalist system and the decline of our empire, which interacts with our economic system so that each worsens the other. That's where we are. Very hard place to be. I'm compassionate with my fellow Americans, left-wingers and right-wingers. It's hard to go through the decline of the empire. It was so much more positive when it was rising. But that's no excuse for not doing it. We do have to face the reality. Otherwise, it will keep on crashing down on us in ways that we will be less and less able to shape or to control. And that would mean sitting down with the Chinese and working out a deal. But so far, no, we have our 7th Fleet over there in their ocean. We fight with them over their little territory of Taiwan. We ring them with military alliances and bases. We do to them what they've never done to us. It's extraordinary. But the illusions about it, the make-believe, the ideological theater performed as this new anti-Chinese Cold War becomes our reality because the other one is gone, is faded away. And the delusion is sustained by imagining that what made the Soviet Union disappear was something the West did. It didn't. The Soviet Union didn't collapse because the West invaded it, or bombed it, or shot at its troops, or anything like that. It fell apart of its own internal contradictions and problems that it postponed, kicked down the road, evaded, until they came back and were presented as more than you could do. That's typically how societies fall apart, in most cases. And why is it important to learn the lesson? Because the question that you all have to ask and answer is whether or not that isn't what's happening in the United States today. The growth period of the United States, the ride up of the empire, was a time when we encouraged and welcomed wave upon wave of immigrants. We understood they brought ingenuity, they brought energy, they brought their youth, they brought their productivity. They literally made America great. Now we can't absorb them anymore, so we demonize them. We turn them from being the agents of success into being the causes of failure. Folks, won't work. Sure, you can deport them, but it's a sign of America's lack of ability to absorb them the way it once did. Think of the irony. Mr. Trump wants to make America great again, to go back to what it was. Yeah, but what it was the welcomer of immigrants. Go take a look at what it says on the Statue of Liberty. It's a sign of decline, as there are so many. The divisions in our society, the hostility, the fact that serious people in other ways would get excited about a government that whacks the 2.5 million federal employees only because it can't get at the 20 million state and local public employees. Has to pretend it's doing everything for efficiency. No, it isn't. The corporate sector's in trouble in America and would like to enjoy tax cuts of the sort Mr. Trump gave them back in 2017. But those are supposed to expire this year, and they would have to because the government's broke. Oh no, we'll save money by whacking federal employees. What an interesting idea. The people who had the least to do with the difficulties of the American empire are the victims of its decline. They won't continue to accept that. May take a while, but they won't. Mr. Trump is an anti-working class leader. He is carrying out what generations of employers have convinced themselves to believe. We can do with less workers than we have. We can pay less. We can do this. You pay a price. You can't do it. You can't make fewer and fewer workers do the same amount of work. They will find ways to block it. It's childish. Same thing, you can't keep cutting the taxes from business and put it on to individuals. They will have a tax revolt, and then the whole system will be in trouble. You can't keep doing it. It's not working. But they're employers. Their eye is on the profits. And if you can do something to improve their profits, they'll let you do it. They can't afford to look at the long-term results because their decisions have to be made now. Their profit has to be good now to move their career up. Otherwise, their career goes down. Capitalism turns out to be its own worst enemy, to have the kinds of problems that it has to turn in to solve. It can't keep finding foreign problems, not foreign immigrants, not foreign trading partners that are cheating us, not a foreign empire that is threatening us. Stop. Look to your own system. It, too, like all previous systems, has a period of rising, a period of success, and then a period of decline and disappearance. Let me conclude by talking a little bit about Europe, because Europe is caught in all of these developments. It may have imagined it could escape them, but now it knows it cannot. Mr. Trump is disrespectful of Europe. He is disengaging from Europe. He's not doing it because of Europe. He's doing it because of the problems of the United States in the world economy. He's gearing up for the new Cold War that's emerging, the one with China. And he knows he has to be focused. He doesn't have enough resources to fight that war, together with the old Cold War with the Soviet Union / Russia, together with the declining empire. It's too many problems, and he doesn't have the resources. So the people he used to be able to work deals with are being told, I'm in trouble. I can't work the deal the way it was. I need it to be better for me, and I'm going to force that, even if it's bad for you. You're my friend, Canada, Mexico, Japan, but you're also a way I have to have more resources to save myself. The Europeans don't want to face that. They think it's just Mr. Bad, Mr. Trump, not Mr. Bad, Mr. Trump. Would have happened sooner or later with the others, no matter what they tell you. Yes, the Democrats will deny and they'll blame Mr. Trump. Childish. It's a little bit like Mr. Trump blames them. You saw that with the absurd story of the eggs. The United States is suffering a wild inflation of egg prices. It has chosen, because it works like denial, it has chosen to blame the egg price inflation on the bird flu. Remarkable. Bacon, which is often eaten with eggs, has also seen a very dramatic price rise over the last 20 years. And at least the last time I remember my biology classes, bacon comes from pigs who do not suffer from the bird flu. Well, what is it? Have pigs had a flu too? Here's the story. 3 or 4 capitalist enterprises dominate in both the pork and egg industries. Not in the same way, it's a bit more in pork than it is in eggs, but it's basically dominated. And for them, a flu, if there is one, it means a shortage of eggs, which means the prices go up. And they have a lot of interest in high prices for what they sell. If the price goes up more than the quantity goes down, their profits go up. And guess what? Across the time of this inflation, their profits have gone up. Hint. This is a story about capitalist enterprise and how it reacts. Egg prices are not just up because there's a flu. Bacon prices aren't up at all because it's a flu in birds. Stop. This is capitalism's tendency to monopoly that's playing out its very old role just again. But here we have the Trump government running around the world looking for eggs. The egg businesses that depend on it aren't looking around. Hint. But you don't need hints. Here's the problem. For centuries, Europe was the center of the world activity, at least those of us in the West think about. Greece, Rome, the great feudal period, the colonialism in which the Europeans carved up the world. Europe is now out of it. Europe is the lost continent. Europe is fading as the United States tries to hold on to its declining empire, and the Chinese are trying to figure out how to use and develop their emerging empire. Thus, the new Cold War is quite different, the U.S. China one, from what was the U.S. Soviet one. Very different, even though the word Cold War applies in both cases. The fading old one and the emerging new one. But they leave Europe lost. And if you look at Europe now, you will see that. The near hysterical notion that in the case of the Ukraine war, that the Russians won even facing the Ukrainians closely allied with both Europe and the United States. The Europeans are now telling us they're going to go on fighting with the Ukrainians minus the United States. That's fantasy. You couldn't win with it. You surely cannot without it. You're going to spend $800 billion on military defense? Two warnings to you. Number one, it'll take you years. Ukraine doesn't have years. Number two, you can only pay for that if you gut the welfare systems of Europe, which are the pride and joy of those people, and they will not give it up without an immense fight that you're just not facing, and which, in all likelihood, you will lose. Europe is in an incredibly difficult spot, one they chose, particularly the leaders now who were the ones who love to proclaim themselves as the close allies of the United States. The United States is going down as an economic empire. If the Europeans are not careful, they will take them down and indeed use them to cushion their own decline. The Europeans don't know how or where or when to begin to develop an alternative strategy to the one that they are being caught up in because they are not one of the two major economic blocs. The United States is showing it's willing to take its chances alone, using up the resources they used to share with Europe, more confident that they can make it without those alliances than with them. Mr. Trump is very confident we will do better cutting our relationships with Canada and Mexico than we would have done had we maintained them. That's the break with Mr. Biden. It's always been a dispute here between the Republican approach and the Democratic approach to perpetuating, saving, supporting, and encouraging capitalism. The problem for both those parties is that that agenda is no longer adequate. They are faced with problems deeper than they're willing to admit, and therefore deeper than they're willing to address. They're caught, and we are caught in and with them. The one thing we have, which these lectures are designed to foster, is the ability to take a step back and look at the situation without the desperate need to deny all the things that I've said, all the things that I've pointed to. We don't need to engage in scapegoating this or that marginal group. Immigrants 1 year, public employees the next year, and who knows who comes next. This is remarkable, a society flailing around, but we can make a difference by thinking straight, talking to one another, listening to analyses that go beneath the surface, not getting caught up in irrelevant theatrical details, but asking the basic questions and beginning to fight back, first at the level of understanding and then at the level of ongoing political organization.